rules police, trolls, those people in the comments. Everybody's got an opinion on what God can and can't do. And that's what we're talking about today.
Well, welcome back. We are going through our 50 New Testament stories that we think everybody should know. And today we're in John 5, and we have the story of Jesus healing the man at the pool of Bethesda.
Yeah, and it oddly enough, it ties into kind of what you were sharing last week with your experience at Bethel Church. So if you didn't catch that, make sure you jump back and watch that story. It's really interesting. It's a great story. But John 5, and the story of the healing at the pool of Bethesda. So Jesus is in Jerusalem for a festival, and there is this pool called the Pool of Bethesda there in Jerusalem, where the sick gathered, people who were lame or blind or somehow some kind of physical issue. They all gathered there because there was I don't know if you call it a legend or a myth, or there was this belief that when the water was stirred, it would bubble up. The belief was there was an angel stirring the water, and the first person that could get in to the bubbling area would be healed of whatever issue they had. And you know, what is reality, what is myth? We don't know.
Right.
We don't kind of that, but that was their belief system. And so there was a man there who had been crippled for 38 years. So if you can, like 30, that's a long time. Yeah. And Jesus is there at the pool, and he sees this man, and he looks at him and says, "Do you want to be healed?" And then the man, you know, not really realizing who he's talking to, has all these excuses. Well, you know, when the water is stirred, I can't. Somebody always beats me in. They always get there before I do. And Jesus, being Jesus, just looks at him and says, "Hey, pick up your mat and walk." Mm-hmm. And instantly, the man's sickness, his crippledness, is healed. He stands up, rolls up his mat, and walks away. Yeah. But what happens is it creates this huge controversy because, and this is what John tells us, if you're interested in the story, John chapter 5 is where you can find it again. Because John says this happened on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And it goes on, he's walking, and the leaders of the Jewish the law, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they see him walk, and they're like, "What are you doing carrying your mat? You can't carry your mat. It's the Sabbath." He's like, "This dude told me to pick up my mat and carry it, and I've been crippled for 38 years, and I'm just going to do what he told me to do." And they're like, "Who is this man?" He's like, "I don't know." And then Jesus sees him again, and they have another conversation. He finds out it's Jesus, and then he tells those Pharisees and teachers of the law that it was Jesus, and it just creates this big issue because of the Sabbath. So talking about that, like, Sabbath rule, why was that such a big deal? Because I don't know that we all, like, especially in the Western world, in America, we don't even have like Sunday laws. We used to have that a couple generations ago. Mm-hmm. But what is the deal with the Sabbath? Why was it such a big deal that not only did Jesus heal on the Sabbath, but this guy was carrying his mat?
Yeah, so you've got these people, these church leaders in this day, and this happens now, who have kind of these rules about rules. And, you know, God had given them the 10 Commandments. He had given them to Moses, who gave them to the people. And really what that commandment about the Sabbath was to honor it, keep it holy, set it aside, rest like God did. God did not go into detail on every single thing you're not to do on that day, but people, you know, created rules about rules of how to, like, you know, live up to this standard. And so Jesus, one, coming in and I guess working a miracle, telling a man to carry a mat, which doesn't seem like work to me, but that
Yeah,
they're
it was a rule.
and it feels like they're just looking for a reason to be mad.
Yeah.
Like that's what it feels like.
Yeah, and not to, I guess not to overly criticize the Pharisees, because at least initially, the heart behind it was we want to honor the Sabbath,
Right.
and we don't want to accidentally dishonor the
Yeah,
Sabbath.
yeah.
But I think when your rules about what God can and can't do keeps you from experiencing what God is doing in the present,
Yeah.
it's probably time to reevaluate your rules.
Go back to the basics.
And I think this really, like you were talking last week, really connects with your experience at Bethel Church. Because I don't know if you've seen it, but like YouTube is awash with people criticizing not just Bethel, but all kinds of churches.
Oh yeah.
Because of what God can and can't do.
Yeah.
God would never do that. Well, when your rule prevents you from experiencing what God is doing, then maybe it's your rule that needs to be reevaluated. Because I just think, I think what happens is these Pharisees, these teachers of law, probably really good-hearted, good-intentioned. We don't know them, obviously, but lacking a humility that they could be wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's just like,
Yeah.
in our world, in our culture, that's something I think we really miss, particularly in church. Like, we're so convinced we can't be wrong. Obviously, we think we're right, but we're
it's
convinced.
A belief. If you have a belief, you think it's right.
There's a difference, right? There's a difference between I think I'm right and I don't think I can be wrong. Because one is like, well, yeah, that's like, I think I'm right. Like, why wouldn't I think I'm right? That's what but like, that's my thought, my belief. But there's a humility that just says, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not 100% about
well,
this.
And I think we tend to major on understanding, which, Bible, there are so many words in the Bible that encourage us to seek understanding, to seek wisdom. And so it's not wrong to want to understand or to want to know things. But sometimes, like you're saying, that gets in our way. You would never tell your 3-year-old child who walks by and says, oh, look, a bee on a flower. You would never, come in and reprimand them and say, we're not doing that right now. That's not what, or that's too much for you to understand right now. You don't understand what that bee's doing, so we're not going to talk. No, we actually are reminded in that moment as adults to stop and wonder at the bee on the flower. It's like, wow, and so I think there's so many things that God wants to do in our lives that are meant to draw us back into that wonder. And I just have really felt recently like I don't want to be on a path or living in such a way that I get to the end of my life. And yes, I plan on going to heaven. I plan on spending eternity with God. But if I get to the end and I missed all that he was doing in these years, I think that's such a tragedy.
Well, I think we've lost the capacity to appreciate mystery. I was just reading last weekend. I think it was last weekend. Our church does a SOAP reading guide: scripture, observation, application, and prayer. And so every quarter we put out a reading plan to make available to our church to say, hey, here's what we're reading together as a community. And we were soaping through the book of Judges. And I think it was Sunday morning. It was either Sunday morning or Saturday morning, because I shared it on our setup team that morning. I was like, hey, I read this in the SOAP guide, in the SOAP study this yesterday or today, I don't remember now. But it's this weird story about the Israelites and the tribe of Benjamin, and there's some, like, basically a civil war kind of erupted because some just really shady stuff that we won't go into. But what happens is God tells the whole group of Israelites to go to war against Benjamin, and day one they get slaughtered. And they're like crying out to God, God, do we go back for day 2? And God's like, go back and they were in the right. And they go back for day 2 and they get slaughtered again. And then they're like, God, what are we doing? He's like, go back for day 3. And I'm reading that and I'm like, I do not understand, because I thought like our thinking is if we're obedient to God, it leads to victory. Now,
Right.
ultimately, eventually,
Yeah.
it did lead to victory.
Yeah.
But days one, like that, in days 1 and 2, like you tell one of those 40-some thousand people that got slaughtered in days 1 and 2, oh, it's going to lead to victory.
It's gonna.
No, like,
all-
wait, we were obedient and we died.
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
so, and I just told our setup team, I was like, I don't understand this, guys. Like,
Yeah.
this is a mystery to me, but this is what I'm left with. But
Yeah.
you were mentioning something else about John 5 that I thought was really interesting about how Jesus didn't criticize the man.
Yeah, we don't have any record in this story of Jesus walking on the scene at this pool of Bethesda where all these suffering people are, and saying to them, "How dare you believe in this, angels stirring the waters thing? I never said that." He doesn't. We don't have teaching from the Old Testament that was going to be a thing, so there's no prophetic word about that but nor does Jesus walk into the mystery and the faith that they are working with. He doesn't walk into it and reprimand them for it and say, I do miracles like this. That's not, he doesn't do that. And so I think that's just that's remarkable, because it's like we see this time and time again, but it's like Jesus sees what faith they do have, and he's like, I can work with that. At least they believe in healing. At least they are they're looking for something more, or they wouldn't be there. They're looking, and I think we can even take that when we're, when we're in conversations with people who maybe their faith is a little askew, or maybe they don't even believe in Jesus.
Or maybe they got like faith in crystals.
Right.
And this rock is going to.
What good is it to walk into that conversation and say, your crystals are sending you to hell?
Right.
We don't, that's not helpful. You walk into it and you say, wow, tell me more about that. Like, what is it about that makes you believe? And like draw them into a conversation about faith and belief and all of that. And then, interject, well, this is what I think. This is, and doing that the way Jesus did it, in such a loving and honoring way of a person's heart, to not come in and tear them down before he heals, but he comes in and he meets them where they are, and he's like,
yeah,
I can work with this.
Yeah,
like,
Jesus always has a way of meeting us where our faith is, not where our faith is supposed to be.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And then leading us to where he wants to take us. And so, well, that is John chapter 5, the healing at the pool of Bethesda. Just an interesting story. We encourage you to read it.
Yeah.
If you haven't, great story. Part of our 50 stories in the New Testament that everybody should know. So we hope you enjoyed it today. What can they do if they want to help us get the word out?
Click subscribe if you're not already, and share the video with someone.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching today. We'll see you next time.